Welcome to the opening session of the University Writing and Research Conference. We are lucky to have 3 presentations today on vibrant legacies, art, culture, and history. My name is Sarah K. Hurst, and I'm a teaching associate professor of French in the College of Arts and Sciences. I teach an upper-level writing in the disciplines WID course in French, so I'm very excited to learn more about the projects that our panelists completed in their university writing courses. Attendees, please do remember to mute your mics so that we can hear the presentations, and feel free to jot down your questions as we go. I dropped a link to the conference program in the chat. There's some advice about how to engage in an academic conference setting and think of some good questions that might relate to the work that the panelists present or your own developing research projects. Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to present, since we have 3 presenters today. Panelists, so Lucia, Anna, and Amanda, I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left, 1 minute left, and when we hit time to move on if necessary. This will ensure that we have time to discuss about your projects and suggestions for the many writing students who are in the middle of their own projects this semester. So thank you all for attending this inaugural session here. We are delighted to start off with Picturing Prosperity, a quantitative content analysis of Dutch by Lucia Falzone. So Lucia is an economics and statistics major interested in how data analysis can help policymakers create evidence-based, data-driven decisions. She is from San Francisco, California. So Lucia, I'll hand you the floor.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen here. So I did this project last spring in my university writing course with Professor Pollack. And our final paper, we kind of were divided into groups, and then we had to come up with an exhibition theme. And so our exhibition theme was the Dutch Golden Age, and my topic in particular was Dutch still lifes. And I think originally I was a little bit intimidated by this project just because it was the final paper had to be quite long. And I was a little bit unsure of how to make it engaging and actually interesting for me to write as a student. And so, as you can tell by the title, I was able to bring in one of my interests and majors, statistics, and combine it with this arts class in a way that made writing this paper really interesting. So just to start off, a little background. A still life is a type of painting that developed in the Netherlands during the 17th century, and it's of objects that cannot move. And although there'll be maybe some insects in the paintings of flowers, they're all known for their use of like color, light, and texture that makes the objects come off out of the canvas and lends this really realistic sense to them.
Zoom.
Another important subgenre of still lifes are banquet pieces, which are of a mealtime. And so you can tell by these 2 examples, there's a white tablecloth. Someone has clearly started eating the food, and they show really kind of, I'd say, the more luxurious end of the types of food that would be found in the Netherlands at the time. And already just from these 2 examples, you can really tell the similarities in the types of objects that the artist chose to portray. I think what stood out to me most was both the silver pitchers and then the white linens on the table, and the peeled lemons are something you'll see a lot in the pieces I show. So why is this important? And so, as I mentioned, my project was during the Dutch Golden Age, when the Dutch Empire was expanding at a rapid rate, and they had access to all these trade routes and these really exotic new foods from all across the continent. And these foods would be reflected in the paintings. So the one on the right is still life with a ham and roamer. There's another lemon. And I think what I found most interesting as I began to look at more and more of these pieces was that there was just no way these foods could be actual meals that people were eating. And I think with still lifes, they're so realistic that people tend to just take them as reality, that like, oh, it's a meal. This must be what they're eating. This must be what's happening. But I began to think like, maybe this is not what's going on. They're choosing these really expensive foods that they now have access to as a way to sort of show off maybe to the rest of the world. Unsurprisingly, I was not the first person to have this idea. Professor Brian Wansink at the Cornell Food and Brand Lab published a paper that had a really similar idea, which was that food art does not reflect reality. And he went across many different continents, many different time periods, and categorized all of the different types of foods, how often they showed up. And his chart that I found most interesting was table 3 from his paper, where it showed indulgences, which is kind of, as I was saying, expensive, more foods that would be harder to come by. And you can tell that the Netherlands had really, really high values for the statistical analysis that they performed. And at this point in my research process, I was super, super excited because here was some really interesting statistical support of my developing thesis. Unfortunately, I could use none of this data because he was found guilty of multiple instances of academic misconduct. He's had 6 papers retracted. He was like fired from Cornell. It was a whole drama. And so I was very uncomfortable basing my entire paper off this author who had been basically like was no longer seen as valid. And so I pivoted to making my own data set. I had a goal sample size of 30, and just to make picking the pieces easier, I chose 6 museums who had prominent Dutch art collections, and I went through their collections and found the banquet pieces, and then further went through and counted out how many of each different type of food there were. And my results are in this following chart. So you have type of food, the observed frequency is a percentage, the expected frequency, the z-score, and the p-value. And a couple important assumptions I made was that I chose to assume a uniform distribution, which is that every single food should be shown at the same frequency. And I also copied Brian Wansing's setup in that he had 20 different types of food, and I chose those 20, hence the 0.05 if you divide 1 by 20. And then the z-score is basically how many standard deviations my frequencies were above or below the mean. And the p-value represents the percentage chance that this data was due to random event, that basically like that this instance was completely random and there's not a bigger pattern going on. So I was interested specifically in foods that showed up at the higher than the mean. So my criteria for finding my, foods of interest was a positive z-score and a p-value less than 0.05, which left me with hazelnuts, olives, apples, grapes, berries, and shellfish. And so I also summarized it in the following chart. You can see the line at 0.05, which was my expected frequency, and then that the foods I found significant are way, way above the frequency chart, with hazelnuts showing up in like 13 about percent of the total foods in the paintings. And so now it was time to summarize all my results. And so what conclusions can we make? The main conclusion that was supported and that I had kind of going into this paper was that the Dutch idealized consumption, and that these pieces were kind of showing the best of the best when it came to mealtime and foods that they were consuming. And this was not only supported in the data I found, but also you can look at portraits, which are a really valuable way to capture the sort of beauty standards and cultural ideals of the time. So the portrait on the right is by Peter Paul Rubens, and he's known for his kind of full-bodied women. He doesn't shy away from skin texture, cellulite, things like that. And so I think that's a really good example of the ways that overconsumption and consumption in general was idealized in Dutch culture during this time. And then kind of on the opposite end of, I guess, beauty standards would be the younger boy on the left, who also is on the heavier side in terms of weight. And I think this leads us to the conclusion that weight is easily seen as a sign of wealth. And throughout this project, I was able to take sort of a humanities discipline and combine it with statistics, which I think helped strengthen my argument and also let me make really valuable conclusions that are a little bit harder to argue with than if there is no science involved. So here are my sources, and thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you so much, Lucia. What a fascinating topic. I'm sure lots of attendees have questions for you on your process, on your data collection, on your conclusions. We will save all our questions to the end, but attendees, if that something piqued your interest, feel free to jot your question down so you can make sure to come back to that idea during our discussion time. For the moment, we'll move to our next presenter. The next presentation is entitled Unraveling the Patriarchy, the Evolution of Russian Women's Identity in Textile Art. This is by Anna Oestreich. Anna is a sophomore from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, majoring in international affairs with a concentration in conflict resolution. She is passionate about studying languages, humanitarian causes, and history. So, Anna, I will let you take it away.
It sounds good. All right. Can you see it well? All right. So hello, my name is Anna, and today I'll be speaking about my paper, Unraveling the Patriarchy, the Evolution of Russian Women's Identity in Textile Art. This paper I wrote for my UW class, the Art and History of Textiles, instructed by Dr. Pollack. So my research is based around the central question: what can textiles reveal about the socio-political context in which they were made? And what do the techniques, the symbols, and the purpose of these pieces tell us about the changing conceptions of idealized femininity in Russia before and after the Russian Revolution? Before I get started, I want to speak a little bit about my research process for this paper. To conduct my research, I relied mostly on the Textile Museum Library, which had a lot of the very specific information I was looking for. I was even able to use books from the Soviet era from the Lenin State History Museum, which was incredibly helpful in my research. Additionally, most of the textiles I analyzed for this paper came from the Coats and Textile Traces Study Collection. And I also had the opportunity to actually go and physically examine them, which definitely helped a lot in my process. After looking at the Soviet textiles in the collection, I began to think about how the woman had been depicted in non-traditional ways. This inspired me to investigate folk textiles to compare them with the Soviet ones, which sparked my idea for my paper. To start off, I wanted to know that the textiles I chose reflect a before and an after. Some of them would be considered Russian traditional folk textiles, like the one on the left there, while others belonged to the constructivist movement, which came about in the early years of the Soviet Union. These two women here are wearing clothing representative of the two styles. This isn't to suggest that folk textiles completely disappeared after the Russian Revolution, rather that the drastic differences between these two underscores a broader tension between traditionalism and radical change. I'll begin my textile analysis with this ensemble, which is an example of a Russian folk costume typical of the 18th and 19th centuries. Given the size and diversity of Russia, it's really difficult to call anything typically Russian, but I chose this ensemble because it features two defining elements of traditional women's dress that were widespread throughout the country: the sarafan and the kokoshnik. The sarafan is the long garment with shoulder straps, which would be worn over top of a linen shirt, and the kokoshnik is the headdress. There's a lot to say about these garments, but for the sake of time, I'll focus on the meaning behind the embroidery. For Russian peasant women, the mastery of embroidery was this indispensable part of their identity. Firstly, this was because women had no choice but to become homemakers in the patriarchal village societies they lived in. Secondly, this is because embroidery held great spiritual significance. Young girls would be taught by the women around them, like we're seeing here in this picture, to embroider various motifs that were believed at some point to give fabric certain powers. Many of these motifs appearing on feminine dress, which stem from pre-Christian Slavic beliefs, reaffirmed the role of the ideal woman within village society. For example, on the sleeves here, we can see lozenges with appended hooks or frogs. This was a pagan symbol of fertility that is also traditionally associated with the magic of dwellings in the home. Obviously, these connotations relate a lot to the role of women as housewives. The next textile I'll discuss is this embroidered towel. I don't have enough time to delve into all of the symbolic imagery here, so I want to focus on the female figure in the center right. This figure is likely intended to be Mokosh, the Slavic great mother goddess and protector of women. She also saw women's work, such as weaving and childbirth, and she frequently appears in folk embroidery. She's usually seen surrounded by people praising her with her arms outstretched, which we can see down here. And interestingly, she's also often depicted wearing a kokoshnik. In my paper, I wrote about how traditions associated with the kokoshnik relate to Slavic pagan beliefs. One such tradition is the superstition that a woman's uncovered hair could bring misfortune upon her family, which is why women wore them in public, wore kokoshniks in public. While the concept that a woman's natural form could bring about destruction is pretty obviously rooted in sexism, it also has to do with conceptions of divine femininity and power. For example, as the mother, the Russian woman was responsible for protecting her children from dark forces, and she achieved this by decorating herself with the textiles she crafted, which had the symbols of the deity she venerated. Notably, this kokoshnik is red, which is a color associated with Mokosh's protection. In doing this, a woman could emulate her in a sense. In my opinion, this does sound quite impressive, but this practice also did further entrench the idea that women belonged to the domestic sphere. And while we're on the topic of this towel, I also wanted to speak a little bit about its purpose. Towels had many purposes in Russian society, but among the Russian peasantry, there was this one tradition where girls would make large stocks of towels, such as this one, in preparation for their weddings. Then they would hand them out to the people there to show off their talents. Additionally, sometimes the marriage contract would be solemnized through the exchange of an embroidered towel. In this custom, the bride's brother would guide the bride to the groom by a cloth tied around her wrist. The groom would then take it and wind the bride around himself 3 times. This can be seen as a very literal representation of how marriage was a contract between men that transferred control over a woman. So this brings us up to the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union in 1922. So the government believed that folk art was in opposition to communist ideology. So they sought out artists to sort of create a new style for the state. This sparked a period of artistic experimentation that led to the constructivist movement. This movement rejected bourgeoisie influence in art, and it emphasized this need to reimagine clothing to fit this version of an idealized comrade. This vision obviously conflicted with centuries of folk tradition, as constructivists argued that art should be devoid of ethnic influence so as to promote this unified and international proletariat society. In the campaign to revitalize the newly nationalized textile industry, many women played key roles. For instance, here we have Lyubov Popova and Varvara Stepanovna, who were in charge of the design workshop for factory printed cotton. Popova and Stepanovna became some of the most influential artists of the constructivist movement, and they were known for their innovative cubist and geometric designs, respectively. But throughout the 1920s and 30s, their colleagues kind of got a different idea of what constructivism would be, and they started to stray from the avant-garde roots and turn towards more overtly political motifs that highlighted production and industry. When constructivists depicted village life, they showed this idealized countryside of collective farms where men and women are working together harmoniously. This textile design is an example of this, and we can see it with the men and women laborers harvesting wheat in the field. Although earning a small wages of their own did give rural women a degree of financial independence that they didn't have before under the Tsar, their experiences ended up being not all that much different from what they were before. For example, family finances would be controlled by the husband, single women would be given the worst, most infertile land allotments, and only men directed the operations. The next textile I want to discuss is called Likhbez, the End of Literacy. At first, I had no clue what to make of this design, but after studying it, I've come to the conclusion that it's probably intended to be women in a classroom. This would make sense with the title. So Likhbez, which means the eradication of literacy, was a campaign to teach adults how to read in the 1920s and 30s. And it really was successful in increasing the literacy rate by a ton, and especially for rural women. And although this was an overall positive development, it's important to note that the program was partially conceived for political purposes. To put it simply, the Soviets did not receive a lot of backing from the peasantry. The government realized that the political jargon that they were trying to shove down their throats was foreign to the 80% of Russians who were peasants. And this made their political platform pretty incomprehensible to the majority of people. And they wanted to fix this. So they tried to fix this through improved literacy in political education. However, many rural people were resistant to this. And this contributed to a divide in political and philosophical worldviews between urban and rural populations, a trend that holds very true, especially true in regards to women's rights. So here in the photo on the right, we see a woman in literacy classes, and the one on the left is a propaganda poster for the Likhbez program, which is specifically calling on peasant women to participate in unions. As you may be able to tell, the Soviets were pretty desperate for more peasant women to support them. In 1923, only 5% of female Bolsheviks were peasants, and the Zhendatel, the Bolshevik Women's Bureau, had abysmally low meeting attendance among women. So why was this? Firstly, it was because a lot of rural women felt really overwhelmed by the social upheaval and violent change that surrounded them, and instead found safety and familiarity. Another reason is because of men. The government did a lot of things that shocked the peasantry, like raising the marriage age to 18, eliminating dowries, and granting both spouses property rights. This created the perception that they were loose-living atheists and that they were intent on destroying the sanctity of the family. As such, the women who tried to attend political meetings would face threats by the men in their communities, and many ended up not attending for fear of being ostracized. So this is the final textile in my presentation. It doesn't have a title to give us hints about what it is like the last one, but judging by the uniforms, I believe that it's supposed to be the Komsomol, the youth division of the Communist Party. And what stands out the most to me here is the conformity, which we can see in all of the women standing uniformly in a line. And this very much reflects what the Komsomol expected of its female members. Similarly to the problems with the Gendatel I discussed before, the Soviets were really struggling to effectively recruit peasant women. For example, peasant girls were expected to do household tasks that their brothers were not. There was also this perception that the anti-religious Kosmosol, which held meetings at night and allowed the intermingling of the genders, would corrupt their daughters. So many young women were forbidden from attending. On the other hand, the Communist Party itself drove women away, even as it attempted to create gender equality. Because it measured female liberation in terms of a woman's proximity to masculinity and ability to perform traditionally male roles, the Komsomol alienated female members. The dichotomy between the domestic backward sphere and the public enlightened sphere meant that the Komsomol belittled domestic labor. It's obvious why this message didn't resonate with young peasant girls. Women were scorned for their association with domestic chores. And this is obviously an association that wasn't of their own doing, but that came from generations of patriarchal norms that were instituted by men. So, conclusions. Finally, my conclusion is that although the USSR did implement a lot of reforms and policy changes that could be said improved the lives of women, a lot of them fell short. A large part of this is how they devalued traditionally female labor, particularly embroidery, which for a very long time had been the one avenue that women had to express themselves with inside of really repressive patriarchal communities. Instead of admiring the contributions of women textile artisans and the ways that they thrived in the face of the hierarchical structures that had severely limited their opportunities, the Communist Party scorned them for something that just wasn't their fault. To the peasant woman who would have wanted to attend university while being told that her mastery of the textile arts made her ignorant and less worthy, representations of emancipated women workers in fabric and in propaganda posters likely evoked a lot of complex emotions. But in spite of their poor implementation, these efforts at least provided some new opportunities for these women. In any case, women, as we know, are very used to overcoming less than ideal circumstances, and many of them did, just as their foremothers had for centuries. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Another truly fascinating topic, which I'm sure will spark many questions when we move to the discussion section. Thank you so much for your reflections. Our last presentation today is A Story of Intersectional Medicinal History in Latin America by Amanda Valenzuela. Amanda is a sophomore studying international affairs with a regional focus on Latin America. Her hometown is Chicago, Illinois, and she works with the Nashman Civic Center here at GW. Amanda, take us away.
Hi, can you hear me all right? Okay, perfect. I do not have slides prepared, but I thought I would just chat with you guys about my project. So thank you so much for being here. I'll be telling you a little bit about my research project. My university writing class with Professor Kristensen was about Africa and the African diaspora. We learned about the lasting effects of colonialism on a diaspora, as well as cultural perseverance and resilience despite subjugation. For me, growing up in a Hispanic household, I always knew that my grandmothers on both sides were healers. It felt like an ancestral gift that's carried from generation to generation. And I decided to research the intersection of Indigenous African and Indigenous American medicinal practices. I'm here today to share with you a passion project that comes straight from my heart, as cheesy as that may sound. And there's lots of information and very little time, so this is a very abbreviated version. So my research aims to understand and inspect the blending of African and Indigenous American medicinal practices in Latin America to highlight the presence and existence of historically neglected intersections of communities. To begin, forcefully displaced and enslaved Africans carried pieces of their homelands with them in their memories, and that served as a tool in their acculturation in a new land. Their ability to survive became attributed to their adaptability. People searched for ways to heal their wounds, practice their religions, and hold on to their indigenous knowledge of survival. Geographer Robert Vokes found that African slaves found replacements for their traditional herbs and medicinal knowledge, pointing to a constant engagement with the new land. So that knowledge of the environment was developed through necessity, so by spending excessive amounts of time interacting with the land, but also through engaging with local indigenous groups that already had a deep understanding of the medicinal wealth that existed in the local flora and fauna. I also found that there's evidence in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, that enslaved Africans may have learned wound care from local indigenous groups. The writings of the royal physician Jean-Baptiste René Poupée de Forte recorded striking similarities between the remedies employed by slaves and native Caribbeans when treating puncture wounds of the foot. They both applied washes made of tobacco ash. This is evidence of potential interactions between the two groups occurring outside the bounds of the historically documented spaces. So now let's turn to Cartagena de Indias, modern-day Colombia. The city struggled with a shortage of licensed Spanish doctors in the early 17th century. Cartagena was a licensed port of entry for slave ships, and as a result, brought people who required immediate medical attention after months at sea. The few licensed doctors in the city were expensive, and the community harbored mistrust against them because of their high mortality rates. It was thought that newly trained and licensed medical doctors from Spain were not familiar with the illnesses, treatments, or terrain that could be found in the new land, so they didn't offer effective treatment and sometimes even caused more harm than good. So as a result, slave traders and locals turned to an unlicensed form of medical care, like those provided by curanderos, that offered affordable care and were more trusted by the community. Geographer Linda Newson shares that many of those practicing were Africans or mulattoes, some of whom indicated they had learned their skills in Africa, while others claimed to have been taught by natives. And the remedies included a mixture of local plants, European herbs, and on occasion, African herbs. So this again indicates that there was some level of exchange of ideas happening between the African and indigenous populations. The unlicensed botanicas and untraditional clinics didn't discriminate based on race and offered affordable and accessible care. African healers became central to the common healthcare system in Cartagena. Their interactions with the local indigenous groups led to a culturally informed form of healthcare that offered effective local remedies and knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants in the region. In the 17th century, in Peru, similar patterns are found between the African and indigenous Andean communities. Afro-Peruvian healers and curanderos look to expand their clientele and network by blending healing traditions from various cultures, some their own and some indigenous Andean or Spanish. One historian explains that they inadvertently became cultural mediators and helped to establish a unique culture in the Andes. And that helped to facilitate the mixture of traditional practices. An example is guarapo, an Andean fermented drink used in potions and concoctions. Garofalo says that Black specialists taught Lima's indigenous residents to include guarapo and foul potions dumped at an enemy's door to harm the inhabitants. So Peru serves as a case study for Afro-Peruvians who functioned as mediators between cultures and became the driving force of a period of cultural experimentation and borrowing. African ritualists and healers created a bridge between Andean and Hispanic practices, reworking them and including their own influence brought from the lands they descended from. Incan practices permeated the social bounds of Spanish society through African specialists, invoking a figure of the Inca in their work. Garofalo highlights that Afro-Peruvians mastered and transmitted native Andean practices and technologies like chicha brewing. They blended different cultural practices and learned from indigenous specialists and elders. The extent of blending became such an important part of Lima in the early 17th century that even women accused of witchcraft were found to have been practicing a complex combination of Hispanic, indigenous, and African religious elements. One specific example that Garofalo describes is one Maria Bribiescas, a mulatto woman raised in Lima, who in the early 17th century sought the assistance of different healers for her romantic woes. During that time, Maria learned different techniques from many different multi-ethnic women healers. She apprenticed and learned from mulatto, indigenous, and mestiza women, as well as one particular woman from Galicia, Spain. She became a respected healer and was widely accepted by the community. In one instance, Maria is recounted reciting words to herself and running a deceased guinea pig, a cui, over a woman's body. The woman had come to her for help with her unruly husband, as it said. She described. The use of guinea pigs as medical tools was a practice based on the Andean belief that the rodent would absorb the illness or impurity of the person. In traditional practices, the guinea pigs would then be autopsied to try and discover the impurity that was once in the body of the human. While it's unclear if Maria performed the autopsy, the practice of running the rodent over the body of a person with misfortune or perceived impurity was an indigenous Andean practice that she presumably learned from one of her mentors, directly demonstrating the mixture and execution of blended medicinal beliefs. We know that cultural transmission happened, as we can see through the accounts of mulatto, indigenous, and African specialists and healers that utilized medicinal practices that didn't belong to only one group, but instead fused the accumulated cultural and historical expertise of several, like in the case of Maria de Bribiescas. What is hard to know is to what extent the fusions occurred, because so much was not documented through the neglect and biases of colonial historians. There's a lot of research left to be done. And additionally, indigenous medicine is predominantly referred to as magic and not healthcare, something that takes away from the value and purpose of the practices that worked well enough to be preferred and adopted into colonial healthcare, as we can see in Cartagena de Indias. What is likely is that African and indigenous healing mix on a much larger scale than we know right now, and that fusion in turn has profoundly influenced modern Latin American culture and medicine. These interactions between cultures can still be seen today in Latin America and have profoundly impacted the way the regional cultures operate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amanda. A third wonderfully fascinating topic. So we have some time now, about 20 minutes for questions. So I'd like to open up the discussion, see if someone in the audience, okay, right out of the gate, Mira, if you'd like to turn on your camera as well, if you're able to, that would be lovely, just so the presenter or presenters you're addressing your question to can hear. But if you're not able to, please don't stress.
Hi, sorry about that. My camera, like I don't have a good webcam, so my video is very good.
Okay, go ahead.
But I have a question for the first presenter, Lucia.
Lucia?
And my question was just like, what research methods did you find useful in like the beginning stages of your research before you identified your specific focus of your project? Like,
I think when I was figuring out what I like really wanted to hone in on for my final project, what was most helpful was just reading a ton of different ideas on Dutch still lives. Like I think I originally was going to talk about like the use of light or something, but I think like maybe listing out a couple different aspects of the topic that interest you, and then like going through each one and seeing what articles you can find. And I think like the more specific, the better.
thank you so much.
Excellent question and excellent advice. Thank you both. Another question could be about an aspect of the writing process. Anthony?
So I actually just wanted to say Anna's presentation about textiles was very impressive. I really liked it. I honestly would like to know how, Anna, if you're listening, how were you able to get so much information? Like I seriously would like to know.
Truthfully, a lot of it was just the Textile Museum has so much. And the coolest part, like I touched on this a bit in my presentation, but I got to read books that came from the Soviet Union. It was like the Lenin State History Museum when it was still Leningrad and not St. Petersburg.
Understood.
And a lot of it was in Russian. So I had to do a lot of translation, but from that, I found a lot of really interesting information that I hadn't been able to find on the internet. So yeah.
Very
Thank you.
nice. Of course. Thank you for sharing.
We'll drop in the link if you are thinking about how to construct a good question. There's some great tips on there. Sometimes it takes a moment to formulate your thoughts. Jacob, did you have please go ahead.
I did. Yeah. First off, 3 excellent presentations. They all actually have a lot of synergy, which was really kind of neat. My question is a follow-up for Anna. I'm curious. I was really intrigued by your line that there was in the Soviet Union a government-imposed conflict between folk art and communist ideology. And I'm wondering if by any chance during your research process, you found any kind of resistance to that enforced communist ideology or underground folk art sort of thing going on?
That's a great question. I think actually, yes. So initially when people were making the new designs that the government had asked them to, the 2 women I talked about that took over the control of the one textile design workshop, they were really appalled because they saw these people and they were like, they don't really represent our ideals, because they were just kind of mimicking a lot of the folk arts that had been commonplace before. So there was a lot of floral motifs and things such as that. Truthfully, I didn't see any resistance to this. I'm sure there was during the time, like any official established resistance, but I think what ended up happening past the period I talked about, which my research I stopped about in the 30s, people just kind of weren't really enjoying the constructivist movement. And so it eventually started to fizzle out, and people did have more like flowery and nature sort of things, which I don't think that the people that were hardcore constructivists would have been happy about that, but it did end up happening.
Thank you.
Brandon.
Hello. My question was for Amanda. I kind of have like two questions. I was wondering what databases you use for your research on Latin American history, because my topic that I'm kind of focusing on is over Latin American history. But I also additionally wanted to ask how you address the challenge posed by gaps in information and underdeveloped resources.
Thank you for the question. I'll start with the first part. I looked through JSTOR. JSTOR is like my best friend for this. But also my professor urged me to look through GW's like large database that they have. So both of those were really, really valuable tools for me. But in regards to your second question, it was hard. There were lots of points where I felt like I hit brick walls when trying to accumulate my research, because like I was talking about in my presentation, there's so many parts of colonial history or even pre-colonial history that are lost simply because the people who were documenting history didn't deem it important. So I mainly tried to look at primary sources. That was my the coolest thing that I could. I mean, I thought it was fascinating, but I found it really helpful. There was a lot of translating that was done, but I looked at different regions and then tried comparing what they all said, and maybe sometimes I found that one writing that spoke about the West Indies also had details about other parts of the Americas that I didn't know, that had I searched for that particular part of the Americas wouldn't have appeared. So I would say just read a lot, read a little bit of everything and experiment and see if maybe different keywords will get a better response for you in terms of what data is available.
All right. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. I think I saw Cameron, and then we'll go to Nick.
I had a question for Anna. When you were picking the images to use for the representations of the textiles, how did you go about doing that? Because there are obviously quite a large range that you can choose from. So just how did you limit down what you would choose?
It's kind of, so I basically picked them by looking at the textiles. So when I say textiles in the Kotsin, a lot of them are like actually paintings that would have been turned into textiles that are still there. But I looked through the ones that were from the same period, which would be 20s, early 30s, that would have been classified as constructivist, and then the ones that had something to do with women. So I made sure yes, they all connected with women. And then for the traditional textiles, I kind of did the same process where yes, for example, I saw Mokosh in the one and I saw the female figures, and then there was the dress ensemble. And then from there, I was able to I kind of formulated my argument after I selected the textiles, because I felt that just by researching them, it sort of created a story that I was able to then unravel, right? So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Nick.
Hi, my question is for Lucia, and I wanted to ask about I think it was said that she was an economics major, and that's exactly what I wanted to do with my research paper, was include something economics related. And I was just interested into what resources or places you look for finding research and data to put into your paper, because I know you said you weren't able to actually use the paper that you had found, but is there a place or a website that you use that you found best?
I also used mostly JSTOR. I think like Amanda was kind of saying, coming up with really specific keywords can often help you like hone in different titles. Like as you probably saw from the article title, like a lot of these academic papers have really, really long titles. So I think using valuable keywords, and then I also really like Google Scholar and ProQuest were also two other resources I used.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Other questions about the topics the synergies between these topics, the writing process. I know many of you are in the early stages of your own projects. Maisie.
Hi, my question's for Anna, and I was just kind of wondering like why you chose to focus on the connection between like women and like the textiles and like why not? And if you were when you first went into research, if like you first went in with like looking for more information about like women's history or like textile industry or like just more about that.
So the truth to this question is that I was assigned a group project where we were all assigned different thematic areas and we had to create a museum exhibition, quote unquote. And the people in my group, we all had very different themes. And so we were talking and we were like, what is the connection about this? So we came to the idea that we were going to talk about social change. And with the Soviet Union, social change, that could mean a wide variety of things. And I think that my paper just kind of ended up taking the form it did because I forced it to be like political science and related. I really am interested by women's rights and movements and also anthropology. So I think that I kind of took this thing that we all agreed we would each write different papers on, and I just sort of made it my own. And it made it easy to do that whenever I had researched the textiles and sort of come to the understanding of how they fit together. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
I see a question in the chat from William Pan. I can read it. It's for Lucia. Is your research into the materialism present in Dutch Golden Age paintings, depictions of foods, were there avenues of inquiry that you had to abandon for the purpose of conciseness in your final paper?
Yeah, really good question. One idea I had that I sort of had to abandon was I wanted to, when I kind of had the idea to go through a statistical analysis and focus on these more indulgent foods, I wanted to trace out sort of where these foods had come from, specifically for the ones that I'd found significant. And that proved to, one, take up just like way too much space in my paper. And also, it was really, really hard to pin down where exactly they would have been importing these from during the 17th century because there was just not much documentation on it. So that was one thing I did have to abandon.
Thank you. We'll maybe go to Victoria and then ping back to the questions that have come through in the chat. Victoria?
Hi, this is for Amanda. You said that when you were researching, you used primary sources from like different places in Latin America, and you found that some of them had like similar accounts. So I was wondering if you could give like an example of one that was like really interesting or really useful for your research.
Sure, that's a really great question. And I love being able to talk more about this. So this makes me very happy. One particular one that I think I mentioned briefly was of Jean-Baptiste. He has a very long name, but of Jean-Baptiste. It was a French primary source, which was tough. But he was writing about, he had a medical log of every person that he saw in his like clinic or hospital throughout a period of time. So it was mainly just looking at that and then also acknowledging that there's so many differences in what used to be called maybe like epilepsy or the fever instead of something else, right? So there's like a generational thing there. But then he would provide specifics about what locals would come to his clinic saying that they had, and how sometimes he would send people away from his clinic and without like saying like, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do, you're gonna die. But they would come back alive in a couple days or in a couple weeks, and it would be because they had said that this had worked for them, whatever that may be. So an example of that was particular like herb layings on wounds that helped the wounds heal faster. So when he reached his limit, when he didn't know what else to turn to, when his medicine from his region of the world didn't match, it's like there was medicine that was there that did. So I didn't find records like that were written by, like indigenous communities, because that's really tough to find. And a lot of it was burned, destroyed, or in a different language, or it was like many reasons. But he was the one that I looked to. And the other thing is also acknowledging that he has biases that he's writing with. Maybe he did take an idea from a local indigenous person or an enslaved nurse that was working with him that he doesn't attribute to them in his writing. So maybe I'm thinking that that's French medicine, but it wasn't French medicine. So there's like a lot of nuance to it. But just directly to your question, it was people dying, or him sending people away thinking that they were dying and then coming back alive, better than ever, thriving, because they'd been able to use all these holistic well-being things that he hadn't considered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fascinating sources. We've got a few more questions in the chat. So we have a question from Nora for Anna. I'm not sure if you had non-English sources in your research. I'm wondering, how do you cite them?
Yes, so I did have non-English sources in my research. For my bibliography, what I did is I wrote the original titles in Russian, and then I had like in brackets the title of it in English. And and there's different guides for what you can do online to find it. And as far as like the actual information in the texts and being able to cite them, what I did was I could find out, okay, on this page, it says that this sort of sarafan is really popular in the northern regions. And then since I'm not citing the text directly, I can just cite that page for that piece of information. So thankfully, just sort of shortening things and summing it up, that helps a lot. Yeah.
Thanks, Anna. We've got another question in the chat from Jack, this time a question for Lucia. Were there any difficulties connecting art and data?
I think once I had the initial idea, it was pretty easy for me to see the connection, especially since an aspect of my paper that I didn't talk about as much in my presentation was that a sort of sub goal of my research was like reprove the article that Brian Wansink had written. And so I kind of used a lot of his structure for his data analysis. I did change the type of statistical test because I didn't have enough like data points to use. But I think I took a lot of my structure from that, and that definitely helped me work through my data and help it feel less overwhelming.
So perhaps a related question, the next one in the chat, also for you, Lucia. I was wondering, this is from Yu Yin Lin. I was wondering, since you use statistical analysis in your research project, do you have any suggestions of what kind of methods to use? Also, were there limitations that you encountered?
Yeah, I think the first important thing is like I have taken a couple of different statistical classes, and like in those, when you have different types of data sets, it's pretty clear what approach you want to use depending on what you want to get out of your data. And so in that regard, it was pretty straightforward. I knew I had to do a z-test, and I knew I needed to get a p-value in order to pick out what foods were important. And I think a limitation I did encounter is in statistics, it's really important to have as large a data set as you can. And I was one student working during finals periods. I definitely could not go through nearly as many paintings as would have been ideal. And I think if I'd had, 2 or 3 times as much time, I could have gotten a lot more data that would have led to more powerful correlations.
Thank you. All right, we've got a question for Amanda from Zizi. Understanding that a specific culture may use specific ingredients and have variations in their practices, how did you handle inconsistencies in your search for remedies?
So you can let me know if I'm answering this in the right way, if I'm getting to the question right. But the way that I interpret this is, about variations in cultures. So one of the things was, it was hard because it's such a broad spectrum. How can I encapsulate like the African continent and the South American or the Latin American region into and then kind of generalize it by being like medicinal practices as though they were similar? That felt kind of to me like playing into that thing of everybody being the same. That is not what I was going for. So in my paper, I write a little bit about how when I'm saying indigenous African people and indigenous American people, there's a lot of variation, right? I'm particularly talking about the transatlantic slave trade. So generally West Africa. But there was very little distinction that I could find where they specified from which group. And then there's a lot of variation within one zone in Latin America, maybe Colombia, since I talk about Cartagena. In that region, there were so many different indigenous groups. It was hard, right? It was hard to pick which one to choose from. It was hard to go at it without overgeneralizing. So I guess, first of all, I just want to make that clear that when I'm talking in my presentation, I'm talking about super rich and different cultures. There's a lot of variation that's being encapsulated in that. And to your question, How did I handle the variations in practices and inconsistencies? I just acknowledged it. Like, I just named that. Like, that was part of it. I only know what I'm reading, right? What I can find. And I think part of doing good research and productive research is naming what you don't know and not just trying to like make something up or fill in a hole that isn't really there or fillable. So for me, it was kind of just like, if I don't know something, if I didn't know something about a specific region, or if there was an inconsistency that I didn't understand, I just named it and was like, I found this here, and this is an inconsistency. Or I would look at other sources about the region that maybe could cancel out that one inconsistency, like try to find an outlier, or like it was kind of use the context surrounding that. But it was tough. Thank you for your question.
So we're running up at the end of our time, but Anna, maybe if you want to talk for 30 seconds about the last question we see in the chat. This is from Andrew. I want to know, did you meet some counter arguments to your conclusion when researching other objects that show communism effectively did change women's status a lot? And how did you make use of those counter arguments?
Okay, yes. So I'll say two things to this. Firstly, I should have emphasized this more, but my paper focuses specifically on the era in the 20s and the early 30s. So the Soviet Union was very much a baby whenever in the period I'm focusing on. So I don't really focus much on the changes beyond that period. And secondly, that I think the main part of my argument that I wish I would have delved deeper into here is more so like how the changes, the changes in policy like really reached. Because it is undeniable that the Soviet Union did implement a lot of policy changes and laws that really did improve the status of women. Like women could get abortions, women could divorce their husbands, women could own property, and these were all really important things. But the problem here is that those benefits primarily helped women in urban centers that were wealthy. And I'm talking mostly about peasant women. And because of various things, such as the fact that they lived in a society that was really hostile to those changes, that limited their access to participating in politics that had to do with the advancement of women's rights. And also that the Communist Party, because their women were hesitant to reach out to them, there was this sort of idea that they don't want our help, they are ignorant and politically backwards. So these two things kind of reinforced one another to make it so that these positive changes that did help women didn't really reach the majority of the population, at least for the period of time that I was talking about.
What a wonderfully rich discussion. Thank you all for your questions. And please join me in thanking our speakers one more time, Lucia, Anna, and Amanda. Truly wonderful pieces. And of course, with lots of rich feedback, certainly from professors Dr. Pollack and Dr. Kristensen. So I hope those of you that were joining us as audience members and are perhaps in your own university writing class have come away with some useful information for your writing process. Thank you all for joining us this evening for this opening event, and please feel free to join other sessions of this year's University Writing and Research Conference. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.